So that's why they wore those big hoop skirts. It was practical. In addition to being young, teachers in the 1800s were usually unmarried. Most school districts preferred that teachers remain unmarried since, again, it allowed them to save money. Teachers who married often found themselves out of work. Some states even included clauses in their teaching contracts that required teachers to resign if they got married. But the situation varied from state to state and district to district. Sometimes a teacher who married would simply continue teaching and not tell anybody. And sometimes a married couple would team teach. That is, a husband and wife would teach in the same schoolhouse, often in different rooms. Occasionally, they might even share a classroom. This was not without its problems. We know from surviving school board minutes that squabbles between married couples were a frequent problem. So much so that some school boards actually passed laws prohibiting married couples from applying to teach in the same school. What about qualifications? Well, formal requirements varied a lot depending on where you lived. Some states did require teachers to pass exams or get certification, but most did not. What really qualified a teacher was experience. If you had successfully managed a classroom in another district, that was the best evidence that you could do the job. As a result, aspiring teachers often began by assisting an experienced teacher. They would help grade papers, monitor students, and otherwise prepare lessons under the direction of a master teacher. This arrangement had the advantage of allowing new teachers to learn the trade while also saving the district money. Unfortunately, this meant that the profession suffered from a lack of standardization. New teachers would bring with them the methods and values of their former schools, and these could vary wildly. Another important fact about teachers in the 1800s is that they almost always taught only one subject, reading. Reading was considered the most important academic skill and took up the bulk of the school day. Other subjects such as writing, arithmetic, geography, and moral instruction were often tacked on at the end of the day. Music, art, and science were rarely taught at all. As a result, if you wanted to learn these subjects, you would have to attend a private academy. Only in the last 2 decades of the century, as secondary education expanded, did science and other subjects start appearing in rural schools. Given these demands, it is not surprising that salaries were low. According to one estimate, in 1838, the average teacher's salary was just over $264 per year. This translates to about $7,000 today, and keep in mind that this was the average. More commonly, teachers earned between $25 and $50 per month. In some places, teachers received room and board in addition to a small stipend. This was particularly true in the South, where enslaved people did much of the housework. In short, teaching was considered more of a public service than a profession. And indeed, many teachers entered the field because they felt called to serve their community. This was especially true of women who were often motivated by religious convictions. But this did not mean that teachers were without ambition. Often they simply lacked options. Remember, this was before widespread higher education for women. So, for most women, teaching was one of the few available jobs that did not involve domestic work. Consequently, many saw teaching as a stepping stone to something better. They would teach for a few years to gain experience and make some money, then leave to get married or take up another career. Some went into journalism, some into business, and some even into politics. In the 1860s, several hundred women from the New England Female Teachers Association met in Worcester, Massachusetts to discuss ways to improve their profession. Their minutes reveal an energetic group eager to advance the cause of education and their own status. They fretted over textbooks, debated educational philosophy, and discussed ways to increase teacher salaries. They also corresponded with members of Congress and lobbied state legislatures. All told, they made remarkable progress. When the association formed in 1837, only 4 states offered teacher training programs. By 1885, when the group dissolved, 26 states had such programs, not to mention dozens of private academies and seminaries. Life as a teacher was not easy. There are countless stories of one-room schoolhouses without heat or light in the dead of winter, with students sitting at their desks shoulder to shoulder while the teacher drones on. Yet, despite these difficulties, generations of teachers kept showing up every fall, ready to begin anew. Okay, let's get back to school, but now we need to talk about the third major presence in the schoolhouse, the school board. School boards set the rules for everything from curriculum to teacher qualifications to school hours. They also hired teachers and determined how much they would be paid. But the exact nature of school boards varied dramatically. In some places, school boards were elected. In others, they were appointed by the state or county government. In still others, they were chosen by property owners in the district. In theory, these officials were supposed to represent the interests of the community. In practice, however, school boards often served the interests of wealthy landowners. After all, most school boards were composed of local elites who were generally male and almost always white. What this meant is that poor people and people of color had little voice in how schools were run, nor were women well represented on school boards, although this did vary from place to place. For example, in 1848, when the New York State Board of Regents proposed a new and more rigid set of standards for teachers, a group of Boston school board members, including 3 women, wrote back arguing that such requirements would make it difficult, if not impossible, for poor people to become teachers. Others, however, thought that standards were too low and called for higher salaries and better qualifications for teachers. These debates were particularly intense in the South where, as we mentioned earlier, teachers were paid very little. This led to high turnover and a shortage of good teachers. In 1860, Louisiana School Superintendent J.S.A. Calhoun urged the state legislature to pay teachers higher salaries, warning that if something were not done, the schools would continue to be poorly attended and staffed by unqualified teachers. Of course, the Civil War would soon put an end to these debates, along with most public education in the South. Let's go back to school. Let's go back to school. Ah, yes. Now that we know a little bit about the people who ran the schools, let's return to the school children to see what school was actually like. Depending on where you lived, your school experience could vary a great deal. There were huge differences between cities and the countryside, and these were further complicated by regional variations. Even within the North, there were stark differences between the schooling available to poor children and that available to rich children. But let's start with the basics. Almost all children between the ages of 5 and 15 attended school, although attendance was highest in the industrialized Northeast and lowest in the agricultural South. Children walked to school, often carrying their lunches with them. Smaller children might eat their lunches, but older children were expected to complete their lessons first. As a result, lunches sat on their desks, growing colder by the hour. Another similarity was the emphasis on rote learning. Students were expected to memorize their multiplication tables, the names of the presidents, and the rules of grammar. They were also expected to read aloud from the textbook, usually in unison with their classmates. Students were disciplined with a variety of punishments. The most common of these was corporal punishment, which ranged from a sharp word to whippings. Corporal punishment was usually reserved for the worst cases, and the best students were rewarded with praise, candy, and books. As the century progressed, schools grew larger and more bureaucratic. At the same time, as manufacturing expanded, schools were increasingly seen as a way to produce a docile workforce. Beginning in the 1840s, advocates for public education started calling for a standardized curriculum that would teach all children the same things in the same way. By the 1860s, this movement had gained enough momentum that Horace Mann and others began drafting model state constitutions that included free, universal, non-sectarian, and graded public schools. Although these efforts failed during the Civil War, they set the stage for the explosive growth of public education in the late 19th century. The life of a student in the 1800s was not easy. In addition to long days spent repeating multiplication tables and memorizing precedents, they had to sit for hours on end at a hard desk. They also had to bring their own supplies, including ink, paper, and a slate. They likely shared a textbook with several other students and had to stand when they wanted to ask a question. Not to mention that the schoolhouse itself might be cramped, dark, and drafty. And that's not to mention the possibility of a harsh teacher or a bully in the next desk. But despite these difficulties, school attendance rose steadily throughout the century. In 1800, only about 10% of children of school age attended school regularly. By 1880, that number was over 50%. Indeed, Americans were beginning to recognize that schools could accomplish many things besides teaching the 3Rs. Schools could keep children off the streets. They could socialize children from diverse backgrounds. And they could teach children how to be good citizens. Better yet, schools were one place where men and women, black and white, could come together as equals. All they had to do was walk through that door and sit down at their desks. Click here to keep learning about schoolhouses and classrooms through additional resources. Back to school. In 1867, a young woman named Eliza Turney boarded the steamboat New Era with a trunk full of books and a head full of dreams. She had just graduated from one of the first normal schools or teacher training schools in the United States. Her goal was to teach America's next generation of students. For Eliza and countless other women like her, the path to teaching was anything but clear. In the mid-19th century, being a teacher wasn't like any other job. It required long hours, little pay, and a heavy dose of selflessness. What motivated these men and women to enter the profession? How did they train for such a demanding career? And what kind of challenges did they face once they stepped into the classroom? Let's get into it. Training and education. Formal teacher training was rare when the century began. Most teachers relied on their own schooling along with whatever resources the community provided. However, by the mid-1800s, normal schools began to appear. These were institutions dedicated to training teachers, particularly women, in both subject matter and classroom methods. Despite the appearance of these normal schools, the majority of teachers still learned by doing. They memorized lessons from textbooks, practiced penmanship, and absorbed advice from older educators. Like most professions, teaching experience counted for a lot. Younger teachers usually assisted more experienced ones, observing and absorbing their techniques. Even after graduating from a normal school, teachers continued to learn from each other through professional organizations and local workshops. Normal schools and apprenticeships helped establish teaching as a respectable profession open to women. But once they entered the classroom, teachers were on their own. The teacher's daily role from dawn until dismissal, the teacher's responsibilities were endless. She arrived early to light the fire in the stove, sweep the floor, and prepare the day's lessons. During the school day, she juggled students of every age and level. At the same time, she was expected to maintain strict discipline and moral order. When the bell rang, students poured into the schoolhouse. The teacher greeted them, checked their assignments, and launched into the day's lesson. Recitations were common, which meant that students would read passages from their textbooks. Then the teacher would ask them questions to ensure they understood the material. This method helped keep students sharp and prepared, but it also placed the burden of learning squarely on the teacher. She needed to know her subject thoroughly and explain it clearly. At the same time, she had to monitor the behavior of dozens of children. If someone got out of line, the teacher had to step in. Sometimes she might scold a student, but corporal punishment was also common. Wielding a strap or a cane became second nature to many teachers. Some used these tools sparingly, while others believed in instilling fear as a means of maintaining order. Discipline wasn't only about punishment, it was also about cultivating good character. Teachers kept a close eye on everything their students did, not just in the classroom, but outside as well. They made sure students walked home with partners and avoided dangerous streets. Sometimes teachers even accompanied their students on these treks, especially if there was a river to cross or a moral hazard to avoid. After the school day ended, teachers didn't really clock out. They often met with parents, attended church functions, and participated in town events. Being a teacher wasn't just a job, it was a calling, the teacher's home life. In rural areas, a teacher's success depended as much on managing discipline as teaching arithmetic or grammar. On top of all that, the teacher had to keep a home. While some teachers lived with their families, many more lived in the homes of local families, boarding around for a week at a time. This arrangement reduced costs for the district but blurred the lines between the teacher's public and private life. A teacher was always under scrutiny. Her manners, her dress, even her conversation could be judged as an example for children. Imagine walking down the street and having every parent you pass by critique your outfit. That was the reality for many 19th century teachers. Their clothing had to be modest, neat, and in good repair. They couldn't wear flashy jewelry or makeup because it would set a bad example for their students. In fact, every aspect of a teacher's life was scrutinized. She couldn't go dancing on Saturday nights or attend parties without chaperones. She couldn't even drive a horse without drawing a crowd of onlookers eager to see if she was up to the task. To top it all off, the teacher had to meet the expectations of her students, colleagues, and the community. Parents wanted their children to learn, of course, but they also expected teachers to shape their kids' character. A teacher who inspired good behavior and strong morals was highly prized. In a time before standardized testing and detailed performance reviews, parents relied on word of mouth and their children's report cards, which often included subjective comments about a student's conduct. Good teachers knew how to balance academic instruction with moral guidance. They organized class trips to the zoo or the museum, not just for fun, but to instill a love of learning and cultural enrichment. They took their students on pilgrimages to nearby factories or farms so they could see real-world applications of their classroom lessons. And they made sure to integrate Bible readings and prayer into each day. Religion played a major role in the lives of most Americans, and teachers were expected to reflect that. Of course, not every teacher was a saintly figure. Some were overworked and underpaid, and some were less than stellar in the classroom. Despite these challenges, the vast majority of teachers took pride in their work. They knew that they weren't just teaching children, they were shaping the minds and souls of the next generation. Challenges and rewards. Eliza Turney was one of those teachers. After graduating from the Oswego City Normal School in New York, she landed a position in a small village several miles away. She moved into the home of a local family, got to know the community, and prepared for her first day of class. As she stood in front of her students, she saw not just eager learners, but the future of her town, her state, and her country. Teaching wasn't just a job for her, it was a chance to make a difference. On that first day, and every day after, Eliza strived to be more than just a teacher. She wanted to be a role model, a mentor, and a friend. She knew that her actions and example would influence her students, and she took that responsibility seriously. Over the years, teaching has changed dramatically. Gone are the days of corporal punishment, thank goodness. And today, as teachers have access to a wide range of resources and technology that makes their jobs easier, but the challenges remain. Teachers still need to manage classrooms, meet the needs of diverse learners, and inspire their students to be the best they can be. Plus, they still have to deal with parents, administrators, and policymakers who often don't understand the complexities of teaching and learning. Despite these challenges, there are many rewards. See Seeing students learn and grow is incredibly satisfying. Knowing that you're making a difference in the world by shaping young minds is a great feeling. And being part of a profession that's been around since the beginning of civilization is humbling. So whether you're a seasoned teacher or just starting out, know that you're part of something special. You're part of the oldest and most important profession in the world. If you're a student, remember that your teachers have a profound impact on your life. They're not just imparting knowledge, they're shaping your character and preparing you for the future. So show your teachers the respect and gratitude they deserve. And if you're interested in becoming a teacher yourself, know that you'll face many challenges, but also that you'll experience profound rewards. Teaching isn't just a job, it's a calling. It's a chance to make a difference in the world. And if you're up for the challenge, it can be the most fulfilling career you could imagine. Thanks for watching. Remember to hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. One-room schoolhouse, a single structure serving all 8 grades from 1 to 8, sometimes more. Imagine a one-room schoolhouse, a single structure serving all 8 grades from 1 to 8, sometimes more. Children of various ages sit together, each trying to learn in their own way. There is no air conditioning, and the smell of chalk dust hangs heavy in the air. Now picture someone standing at the front of this room, tall, stern, and authoritative. This person is the teacher, the backbone of this community's educational system. Their job is monumental. They must manage a classroom full of mischief, make sure everyone learns something, and serve as a role model for the community. Who is this teacher? What kind of training did they have? How were they hired? And what kinds of challenges did they face? Welcome to my channel. Today, we are going to look at the life of a teacher in the 19th century. Make sure to watch till the end to find out how you could be a teacher too. Most one-room schoolhouses had only one entrance, which doubled as the entryway and the exit. If you wanted to ask the teacher something or pass a note to a friend, you had to walk past your desk, interrupt the lesson, and then return to your seat. Distractions like this were constant, and the teacher had to remain calm and focused in order to maintain control. Discipline was one of the most challenging parts of teaching. A room full of children, many of them restless and mischievous, required firm control. Teachers used a variety of methods to enforce order. Misbehaving students might be made to stand in a corner, wear a dunce cap, or copy lines repeatedly. Some schools kept a paddle or ruler nearby. At the time, such discipline was not seen as cruel, but as a necessary step in shaping character. Parents often expected teachers to be strict, believing that firm control built respect and responsibility. In fact, some parents went overboard demanding corporal punishment for minor infractions. So if a child wasn't behaving properly, some parents would insist that the teacher strike him with a ruler or other instrument. While there was no national standard for corporal punishment, most states allowed teachers to use physical force when necessary. As the one-room schoolhouse didn't have separate facilities for boys and girls, students of both genders were forced to sit together. This posed unique challenges for teachers who had to maintain decorum and ensure a safe learning environment for all. Students were often encouraged to work in pairs and groups, which helped them develop social skills and learn from one another. However, at times these sessions could turn into boisterous games rather than productive study sessions. To combat this, teachers had to constantly monitor student interactions, ensuring they remained both educational and appropriate. The dynamics between students were also influenced by the competitive nature of the education system. Since there was no grade inflation, students were ranked against each other, creating a hierarchy within the classroom. The top student was often seen as a rival by the rest, leading to tensions that the teacher had to navigate carefully. Moreover, the age gap between students was significant, with older kids entering first grade at around 7 or 8 years old, and continuing until they were 14 or 15. It meant that younger children had to mature quickly to keep up. This compressed learning environment demanded that teachers be sensitive to the needs of different age groups while ensuring that none felt left behind. In addition to academic instruction, teachers had a major role in shaping students' moral and religious values. They served as role models and mentors, guiding children to become responsible and contributing members of society. Communities often chose teachers who exemplified the values they wanted instilled in their children. The one-room schoolhouse was a microcosm of the community, and the teachers' actions and beliefs had a profound impact on the students. It is important to note that despite their central role, teachers were not always respected or valued members of the community. They often faced criticism and scrutiny from parents and administrators who had high expectations but limited understanding of the challenges they faced. Teachers were frequently judged solely on their students' academic performance, which was influenced by factors beyond their control, such as poverty or lack of parental support. Furthermore, given the low pay, teaching was often viewed as a temporary occupation, typically undertaken by young women who would eventually leave to get married. This transient workforce led to high turnover rates and limited opportunities for experienced teachers to advance in their profession. Despite these challenges, dedicated educators continued to strive for excellence, recognizing the profound impact they could have on the lives of their students. We hope this has given you some insight into the multifaceted role of a teacher in the 19th century. We want to know more about your experiences as a student and teacher in the comments below. And now we're gonna tell you how you can become a teacher yourself. Although many people became teachers because they liked working with children, others taught because they needed income. For most of American history, teaching was considered women's work and was seen as a natural fit for those looking to earn money while maintaining their domestic roles. Male teachers were more likely to teach lower grades and were often employed in rural areas where few other professionals could be found. Women, on the other hand, dominated the profession overall and were generally preferred to teach higher grades, particularly in more affluent urban areas. But that doesn't mean they had it easy. In order to be hired, female teachers had to meet stricter requirements than their male counterparts. They were expected to be unmarried and preferably under 30 years of age, which presented a dilemma for many women who wanted to continue teaching once they got married. Because of this, some states passed laws that automatically dismissed married women from teaching positions. This practice ensured that classrooms remained orderly and that younger students wouldn't be exposed to inappropriate influences. As a result, female teachers were subject to greater social scrutiny than men in the profession. They were expected to present an image of femininity and morality, adhering to strict dress codes and avoiding any behavior that could bring shame upon themselves or their families. Female teachers were often prohibited from dating or even speaking to men while at work. These restrictions aimed to protect the sanctity of the profession and prevent scandal, but they also limited the personal freedom and autonomy of female educators. Despite the constraints placed upon them, many women found fulfillment and purpose in their work as teachers. They played a vital role in shaping the minds of future generations and contributing to the intellectual growth of their communities. To become a teacher, one typically began by reading books on pedagogy, the theory and practice of teaching. Although formal teacher training institutions emerged in the 19th century, most teachers were not trained in them. Training schools were usually affiliated with colleges or normal schools, which focused specifically on teacher preparation. These programs offered a structured approach to teaching, covering topics like classroom management, lesson planning, and child psychology. However, it's important to note that not all teachers pursued formal training. Many, especially those working in rural areas, might have been hired based on their general knowledge and ability to instruct. Nevertheless, the rise of training schools marked a significant step towards professionalizing the teaching profession. After acquiring the necessary knowledge and skills, aspiring teachers would typically need to secure a license to teach. Licensing requirements varied by state, but usually involved passing an exam that assessed basic academic skills and pedagogical knowledge. The examination process helped ensure that teachers had a minimum level of competence and were prepared to instruct students effectively. Once licensed, teachers could begin their careers, typically in one-room schoolhouses that served as the primary educational institution for small towns and rural communities. These schools often had limited resources and large classes spanning multiple grades, providing new teachers with a challenging yet formative experience. If you think you'd like to learn more about one-room schoolhouses, check out our video on the one-room schoolhouse. Or if you're interested in learning more about other jobs during the 19th century, click here to watch the life of a doctor in the 1800s. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss an exciting episode. The school bell rings, its sound echoing through the decades like the final note of a song. You can almost hear the whispers of children running to their desks, the squeak of chairs, and the rustling of pages turning as they recite their lessons. But in the air, there's another presence, the shadow of a woman standing before them, the school teacher. Welcome to Life Noggin. Now it's easy to think of teachers as having it easy. We spend most of our days playing and learning, and maybe we get a few days off here and there, which is awesome. We know that being a student isn't exactly all fun and games because, well, we've been students ourselves. There are tests and pop quizzes and group projects gone awry and labs where something always explodes. But outside of our own experiences, we rarely think about what teaching is really like, especially back in the olden times. Picture this, it's the mid-1800s and you are a school teacher. Classes are in session and you're doing your best to keep things under control. In this time period, the ideal teacher was seen as someone who was unmarried and unattached, someone who could devote themselves fully to the task of educating the next generation. However, as with any job, qualified candidates were hard to come by, meaning the position often fell to women who were already employed as domestic servants. And if you weren't a natural caretaker, the job was even harder than it looks today. For example, one of the biggest challenges you face was loneliness. As a teacher, you'd likely live far from home, boarding with the families of the children you taught. That meant your weekdays were spent inside the house, often with no other adults around. Once school was out for the day, you'd spend your time cleaning, cooking, and taking care of the household, only leaving when it was time to do it all over again the next day. Plus, you had to be careful how you behaved at all times. After all, your reputation had to remain spotless. A teacher caught dancing cheek to cheek with a member of the opposite sex could quickly find herself ostracized by the community. If you were a man, though, the same courtesy wasn't extended to you. As long as you abstained from having relationships with other people's daughters, you were free to do as you pleased. As you go about your daily routine, a chorus of childish giggles drifts from the playroom. Oh, to be young and carefree once more. But as much as teachers needed to set an example, the demands of the job didn't leave a whole lot of time for fun. Between planning and grading assignments, meeting with parents, and making sure the schoolhouse was ready for the next day, there wasn't much time to spare. And as the old saying goes, work expands to fill the time available for it. So if you were lucky enough to have some free time, you probably just took a nice long nap. But when it was time to teach, there was no shortage of eager faces waiting for you. From the 1840s to the 1870s, schools were still segregated by gender. Girls learned in one room with a female teacher, while boys were taught in another by a male educator. Your typical classroom would consist of between 30 and 60 students, with younger kids sitting on benches and older ones at desks. All of them would be buzzing with energy, so you had to raise your voice above the din. You'd start the day with a recitation of multiplication tables and other memorized facts. And if anyone got an answer wrong, they'd be sent to the dunce corner to ponder their mistake until they were ready to try again. This went on 4 hours as you made your way through subjects like reading, writing, and arithmetic. Now, all this teaching had its rewards. Most educators found the work deeply fulfilling. Knowing that you were shaping the minds of children who might otherwise grow up illiterate was a noble calling, especially in small communities where the schoolhouse was the center of social life. As a teacher, you were a respected member of the community, often becoming a lifelong fixture in local memory. Additionally, the impact of your work was immense. Even if you taught only a dozen students each year, over time you'd help spread literacy, discipline, and knowledge across an entire generation. It's easy to forget that before the late 1800s, formal schooling was uncommon. Homes were often filled with children who were responsible for working alongside their parents. Formal education was largely reserved for boys who could afford to be tutored at home or attend a preparatory school. The role of the teacher was to not only educate these children, but also instill in them values that would help them succeed in life. And let's face it, teaching is hard work. As a teacher, you do need to arrive at school early to prepare your lessons and make sure everything was in order. Then, after spending hours reciting textbooks and trying to engage your students, you'd need to grade their assignments and plan for the following day. It wasn't unusual for teachers to spend upwards of 12 hours a day on their work. So, when you see those old schoolhouses, envision the solitary figure standing before the class. Sometimes stern, sometimes gentle, but always determined. You'd be surrounded by dozens of little faces looking up at you, eager to learn the world. With each chalk dust-covered lesson, each spelling word memorized, and each line of handwriting practiced, you'd lay the foundation for a brighter future. Although you might not have had all the resources or support you needed, you pushed on undeterred. And thanks to your efforts, more and more children were gaining access to education that would change their lives. Despite the odds, teachers braved the isolation, the lack of pay, and the endless chores because they believed in the importance of their work. They knew that by educating the next generation, they were helping create a better future. Though the image of the 1800s schoolroom may conjure up images of one-room schoolhouses and blackboards, it's also important to remember the quiet hero of that scene, the teacher whose dedication helped shape the world we live in today. So here's to all the teachers out there, past and present, who dedicated their lives to shaping young minds. Your impact is immeasurable and your legacy will live on forever. Now that we've talked about teachers, let's talk about school. Check out this video we did on corporal punishment in school. And if you want to learn more about history for yourself, head over to our website to learn more about historical tales brought to life. As always, this has been Life Noggin. Don't forget to keep on thinking.